A Earth officer frees an alien warrior from captivity and uncovers a secret about a family relationship. The chaos of battle had long faded, leaving nothing but the hum of distant machinery and the occasional echo of muffled voices. Lucas Harlan stood amidst the wreckage of Nova Hub's forgotten sector, his pulse still racing from the fight. His mission had been a success. Varic, the influential merchant, was safe, but the weight of the victory felt hollow as the adrenaline that had kept him going began to wear off. The artificial lights of the station buzzed overhead, indifferent to the lives that had been lost in the firefight just hours earlier. Now standing in the dimly lit hallway of his temporary quarters, Lucas could feel the fatigue pressing on him like an anchor. The mission had drained him physically and mentally, but there was something else gnawing at him. He couldn't shake the feeling that this victory, this moment of respite, was fleeting. The enemy forces were still out there, the ones that had tried to ambush Varic. It was only a matter of time before the next fight would come. Yet in that quiet moment, Lucas could afford to forget, if only for a while. He staggered into his room, the door sliding shut behind him with a soft hiss. His boots clanged on the cold floor, and his hand instinctively reached for the bottle of liquor he'd left on the table the night before. The burn of the alcohol in his throat did little to quell the lingering unease inside him, but it was enough to dull the sharp edges of his thoughts. A victory was a victory, right? That's what they said, but it didn't feel like it. Lucas let himself fall onto the bed with a soft thud, clothes still on the room spinning slightly from the alcohol. He was too tired to care. He closed his eyes, letting the quiet surround him, only the faint sound of his breathing filling the space. He thought for a moment about the mission, how Varic had been targeted, how he'd pulled him from the jaws of certain death, but his mind wandered. A noise broke his stupor. Something shifted in the corner of the room. He blinked, pulling himself upright, disoriented. At first it was the kind of noise one would ignore, the sound of something moving just out of sight. But then the figure in the corner became clearer. A woman, tall, with striking features that were almost too perfect to be human. Her skin, a smooth grayish hue, glistened faintly under the dim lighting, and her eyes, sharp-focused, were locked on him, full of an intensity that made his heart skip a beat. She was kneeling, her hands bound to the chair she was sitting in, the light filtering through the thin curtains, casting long shadows across her face. Lucas blinked, the fog of drunkenness still thick in his brain as he tried to process the scene in front of him. It took a moment longer than it should have before he realized the gravity of the situation. The woman was no ordinary prisoner. She was an alien, and yet for some reason she was here, his reward. His reward. "Who are you?" he muttered, still too drunk to grasp the significance of her presence. Her gaze didn't waver. Her voice, when it came, was calm, almost cold. "I am Selis, warrior of the Keshari tribe, and I've been given to you." Lucas's mind raced. What was going on? Why was she here? Who would his hand reached for his blaster instinctively, but it was still holstered untouched. He hesitated, his hand falling back to his side. His thoughts struggled to catch up with reality. "Why are you here?" he asked again, his voice hoarse, unsure. "I am your reward for completing the mission. A token, a gift." She explained as though she were telling him something mundane, like the weather or the time of day. Lucas's head spun as his mind tried to make sense of her words. A reward for what his mind was too foggy to process everything all at once. He had to get a grip. As the alcohol dulled his senses, another question nagged at the back of his mind. How had this woman, this Selis, ended up here? He was just an officer, a soldier. He wasn't a caretaker of aliens or some kind of diplomat. So why had Varic or someone seen fit to send her to him? Her eyes flickered toward him, as if she could sense the confusion clouding his thoughts. "You don't understand, do you?" she said quietly, her voice tinged with something like amusement. Yet underneath it, there was something darker, something tragic. "You have no idea what you've gotten yourself into." And in that moment, Lucas knew that this was no simple reward. There was far more to this than he could have ever anticipated. The last thing he remembered before succumbing to sleep was the faintest sense of foreboding, like the calm before the storm. The weight of Lucas's exhaustion hung heavy in the air. The liquor, though potent, couldn't dull the rising tension in his chest as his mind whirred with questions. Who was Selis? Why was she here? His thoughts swirled in the haze of his hangover. But one thing was clear, she was not a prize, not in the traditional sense. She was a person, and despite the strange circumstances, she was now his responsibility. He rubbed his eyes trying to focus. Selis was sitting silently in the chair, her hands bound behind her back, her posture straight and proud despite her confinement. Her piercing gaze met his unwavering. There was a quiet intensity about her, something that spoke of strength even if it was tempered by something darker lurking beneath. "What's your story?" Lucas finally managed to ask, his voice rough. He didn't expect much, but at this point it seemed the only way to begin to unravel the mystery. "I am a warrior," Selis began, her voice measured and cold. "Of the Keshari people. My kind is known for our strength and our combat prowess. I was taken." She paused as if choosing her words carefully. "I was captured, sold, and used for purposes I'd rather not discuss." Her expression darkened, and Lucas could feel the weight of her words settle in the room. "Sold," Lucas echoed, now feeling the first stirrings of discomfort in the pit of his stomach. "What do you mean by that?" "I was meant to be sold to an underground syndicate. I have enemies, people who would see me enslaved and exploited. But your mission," she said the word practically dripping with venom, "interfered with their plans. Varic made sure of that." Her tone soured as she mentioned his name. "Varic," Lucas repeated, now piecing together fragments of a puzzle that was far too complicated for a hungover mind to decipher. "Varic is... Why are you here?" Selis nodded. "He orchestrated your mission. He made sure you would succeed, not because he cares for you, but because he needed you to take me. You're my protector now." The words fell heavy in the air. Protector. The very idea struck Lucas as absurd. He was an officer, a soldier, nothing more. He wasn't prepared for this kind of responsibility, certainly not one that involved an alien woman with an unknown history. But there was something in her voice, a quiet plea hidden beneath her prideful exterior, that made him hesitate. He looked at her again, really looked at her, and saw more than just an alien warrior. She wasn't a trophy or a prize. She was a person in need of help, trapped by forces beyond her control. Her past, whatever it was, had left her scarred, and now she was looking at him as if he was the only one who could help her. Lucas shifted uncomfortably on his feet. "So what now? You expect me to just take you in?" The words came out harsher than he intended, but Selis didn't flinch. Instead, she studied him with the same inscrutable gaze. "Isn't that your duty?" she asked. "To protect those who cannot protect themselves?" Lucas clenched his fists, feeling a mixture of frustration and guilt. He wasn't equipped for this kind of situation. His job was to fight, not to act as some kind of guardian for an alien who was clearly a part of something much larger than he understood. But then again, how could he just leave her? How could he turn away from someone who was asking for help, no matter how difficult or dangerous the task might be? "Fine," he muttered under his breath. "But we need to figure out what to do next." His eyes drifted toward the door, half expecting some kind of immediate threat to burst through. He had no illusions about the kinds of people who were hunting her. Whatever Varic's reasons were, they were dangerous, and those who sought Selis would stop at nothing to capture her. "You don't trust me," Selis said suddenly, her voice a soft accusation. "I can see it in your eyes." Lucas shifted uncomfortably, his gaze falling to the floor. "I trust you as much as I trust anyone in this mess." He couldn't help the frustration in his voice. "But I don't trust your enemies. And I don't trust Varic. He's the one who handed you over to me like some kind of... like I'm supposed to be your jailer." Selis's expression softened, and for a moment Lucas saw something human in her. Her lips parted as though she might say something, but then she sighed instead. "Varic has his reasons. He loves me in his own way." The way she said it left Lucas with more questions than answers. Love. Was that why he had done this? Had he sent her here to Lucas to keep her safe? Or was there something more sinister behind it? "Look," Lucas began, trying to gather his thoughts. "We can't stay here. There's no telling how long it'll take for those people to catch up with us. We need to get you off Nova Hub, get you somewhere safe." Selis nodded, her expression unreadable. "You are right, but be warned, officer, once you take me out of here, there is no going back. There will be no safety. My enemies will hunt you as well. Lucas hesitated for only a moment before nodding. He didn't know what the future held for them, but one thing was clear. They had no choice but to face it together. Whatever had drawn them together, whatever Varic's true intentions were, Lucas had made his choice. He would protect her. For now. As Lucas turned toward the door, he couldn't shake the feeling that this mission, this strange twist of fate, had only just begun, and that the real battle was yet to come. Lucas's hand hovered over the door's control panel, his mind racing. The words Selis had spoken earlier haunted him. Once you take me out of here, there is no going back. But he had made the decision. He couldn't just leave her to the mercy of whatever enemies were tracking her. Not when he could do something about it. "Are you ready?" he asked, looking back at her as she rose from her chair with ease despite the restraints. Selis's eyes never left his, but she didn't answer immediately. She stood tall, every inch of her, composed and purposeful. It was hard not to see the warrior beneath the surface. Every movement seemed calculated, a reflection of her race's martial prowess. "How long do you think you'll be able to protect me?" Selis asked, her voice low but sharp. There was something like a challenge in her words, a test of his resolve. These people, they will not stop. They will hunt you to the ends of the galaxy. Lucas straightened, turning to face her fully. "I've been through worse," he said, his tone firm, though there was an edge of uncertainty beneath the bravado. "And I'm not backing down now. You need me to get out of here, and I need to make sure you're safe." "You are foolish to think that you can outrun them forever." Selis countered, her gaze intense. "You'll tire, and when you do, they'll catch up. You'll regret this decision. They will make sure of it." Lucas clenched his jaw. There it was again. The way she spoke, calm, calculated, but with a sharpness that cut to the core of him. He had no illusions about what they were up against. He wasn't an expert in dealing with intergalactic criminals or shady underground organizations. But he was an officer, and an officer's duty was to protect. "I'm not worried about me," Lucas said, his voice softening. "I'm worried about you. You've been through hell, haven't you?" Selis's eyes flickered with something unreadable, but she said nothing. She didn't have to. The weariness in her face, the rigid control she kept over her emotions, it told him more than any words could. She had been broken before. She had learned to fight to survive, but the scars of her past had left deep marks. "You don't have to do this alone." Lucas added, his tone more earnest now. "We can make it out of here together." Selis's lips parted as if she might argue, but then she closed her mouth again, her shoulders shifting in a subtle gesture that told Lucas she was trying to suppress whatever it was that threatened to rise to the surface. He couldn't imagine the kind of pain she must have endured being captured, soul used. It wasn't just physical pain that had marked her. It was the emotional scars that made her hesitant to trust anyone. "I've never done this with anyone before," she said quietly, as if confiding a secret, though her eyes remained sharp. "I've always been alone, always had to fight, for myself, for my survival." Lucas's heart softened at the admission, his gaze shifting to her bound hands. He crossed the room quickly and gently unlatched the restraints. "You don't have to be alone anymore," he said, his voice almost a whisper. "I'm here now, and I'm not leaving you." Her eyes met his, and for a moment there was a flicker of something, vulnerability perhaps, but it was gone before Lucas could fully understand it. "You don't know what you're getting into," she said, her voice tinged with something close to warning. "The people after me, they don't stop. They don't forgive." Lucas exhaled slowly, taking a step back to give her space. "Then we make sure they never catch us." They shared a brief silence, each contemplating the weight of what was to come. There was no grand plan, no way to predict what would happen next. Only the certainty that they would have to rely on each other if they were going to escape. "Let's get moving," Lucas finally said, his tone steady. He turned toward the door again, this time with a sense of purpose. "We have a ship waiting for us. The sooner we leave this place, the better." Selis's eyes narrowed slightly, and she followed him without a word. Her movements were fluid, precise. She had the kind of grace that came with years of training, years of survival. She was not weak, far from it, but there was something in her posture now, something softer that hadn't been there before. As they made their way down the narrow corridor of the station, the weight of the mission felt more tangible with each step. The shadows of danger lingered in the corners of the halls, but Lucas kept his focus ahead. The station was eerily quiet now, the usual hum of activity replaced by an ominous stillness that only heightened the tension. "We'll be out of here soon," Lucas said more to himself than to Selis, but she heard him all the same. "Where are we going?" she asked, her voice surprisingly calm, though her eyes flickered toward him with a hint of curiosity. "Somewhere safe," Lucas replied, glancing back at her with a slight smirk. "The Earth Alliance. They'll help. But first we need to get out of Nova Hub." They turned a corner and Lucas's eyes scanned the hallway, ever vigilant. Selis walked a few paces behind him, but Lucas could feel her presence in the space around him, her quiet energy mixing with his own. It was a strange feeling knowing that he was now part of something bigger than the mission itself. His duty had always been to follow orders to complete the task, but now his duty felt personal. He had a responsibility to protect someone who needed him, someone who might just have the strength to keep him going when everything else seemed uncertain. As they neared the exit, the hairs on the back of Lucas's neck stood on end. A sound faint at first reached his ears, the unmistakable hum of an approaching ship. "Move!" Lucas hissed, grabbing Selis's arm and pulling her into an alcove just as the sound grew louder. The threat had come faster than he had anticipated, but they weren't caught off guard. Selis's eyes gleamed with a predatory focus. "They've found us." Lucas's grip tightened on her arm as he peered around the corner, his heart pounding in his chest. "Then we fight." The air around them felt charged, every breath heavier than the last. Lucas's grip tightened around Selis's arm as they crouched in the shadows waiting for the inevitable. The sound of the ship grew louder, closer its engines, a constant, ominous thrum that vibrated through the floor. The Nova Hub wasn't quiet anymore. It was alive with danger. Selis's eyes scanned the dimly lit corridor, her body tense, poised like a coiled spring, ready to strike at a moment's notice. She had been in situations like this before Lucas could tell, but this time she wasn't alone. She was depending on him just as much as he was depending on her. "How many of them?" Lucas whispered, though he could already feel the answer in his bones. They had been followed. The enemies hunting Selis were no strangers to brutality. "I don't know," Selis replied, her voice low and steady, though her eyes betrayed a flicker of unease. "More than one, and they won't be alone for long." A flash of movement down the corridor caught Lucas's attention. Two figures silhouetted in the harsh overhead, lighting moving with purpose. The pursuit had begun. The way they moved, quick and methodical, told Lucas all he needed to know. These weren't casual hunters, they were professionals. The kind of men who didn't hesitate. "Stay low," Lucas ordered, pulling Selis further into the alcove as they pressed their backs against the cold metal wall. His pulse thudded in his ears, a steady drumbeat that drowned out everything else for a moment. He didn't have to look at her to know that Selis was already preparing for what was to come. She was a warrior after all. Her instincts were honed. But even she had to know that escaping these hunters wouldn't be easy. The figures rounded the corner, and Lucas held his breath, pressing further into the shadows. The two pursuers, humans but with an air of the unknown about them, seemed to be scanning the corridor, unaware of the two fugitives lying in wait. "They're right there," Selis whispered, her voice barely audible. She shifted slightly, the slight rustle of her clothing sending a wave of panic through Lucas. He stilled her movement with a hand on her arm, holding her back. Every second counted. He couldn't let the slightest noise betray them. The figures came closer, their footsteps louder now, the scrape of boots on metal unmistakable. Lucas watched them carefully. They were getting too close too fast. His heart raced, but his body remained frozen, unwilling to make a sound. "Now!" Lucas breathed just as one of the pursuers turned to face their direction, his eyes narrowing suspiciously. Lucas's hand shot out, grabbing Selis's arm and pulling her into a sprint, just as the man's gaze landed on the alcove. They darted down the corridor, their footfalls quick and frantic. The pursuit had begun in earnest. Selis, swift and agile, moved ahead, her movements a blur, as she pulled Lucas along with surprising force. They tore around the corner, narrowly avoiding the line of sight of the two men. But the sound of their pursuers' boots echoed behind them, growing fainter at first but quickly gaining ground. Lucas could hear their heavy breathing, the muttered curses. "Keep going!" Selis barked over her shoulder, pushing him to run faster. Lucas didn't need to be told twice. The walls of the station blurred past them, an endless stretch of cold steel and flickering lights. His lungs burned, but there was no time to think about the pain. Only the race. Another turn, another hallway, every corner they rounded felt like a gamble, a risk they couldn't afford to take. They had to get to the exit to the ship, but Lucas knew it wasn't going to be that easy. They were in the heart of Nova Hub, a station rife with dangers and underworld dealings. The hunters would have the station locked down soon enough. The sound of the ship's engines grew louder, signaling their approach, and Lucas's heart skipped a beat. They were so close. The docking bay was just ahead, but the hunters were still on their trail. They weren't far behind. Every second felt like an eternity. Over there, Selis shouted, pointing to an emergency access panel just above the floor. "We can slip through there and avoid the next security checkpoint." Without thinking, Lucas followed her lead, reaching for the panel with shaking hands. His fingers fumbled as he ripped off the cover, exposing the cramped maintenance tunnel behind it. Selis didn't hesitate. She was already climbing in her body, moving with precision. "Go now," she urged, her voice tight with urgency. Lucas scrambled after her, barely making it through the small space, before he heard the first shout from their pursuers. He could feel the heat of their breath on his back, their footsteps echoing in the narrow corridor. Time was running out. The maintenance tunnel was cramped, the air stale and oppressive, but it offered them a temporary refuge. They crawled forward, the only sound of their breath shallow and ragged. Lucas's mind raced. The ship was so close, yet it felt like they were miles away from safety. If they could just reach it, if they could just get to the ship. He didn't look back. There was no time for hesitation, no time for fear. The only thing that mattered now was getting to the ship. Suddenly there was a distant bang, the sound of a door slamming open somewhere far behind them. The pursuers had found the maintenance tunnel. They were closing in. "Keep moving," Selis urged, her voice low and controlled despite the rising tension. Lucas pushed forward, his hands scraping against the rough metal of the tunnel walls. Sweat stung his eyes, but he didn't dare stop. He couldn't. Wobble. As they neared the end of the tunnel, a sliver of light appeared ahead. The docking bay. They were so close. But just as they reached the end, a voice echoed from the other side of the vent cover. "They're here. Get to the docking bay." Now Selis's eyes locked with Lucas's, and for the first time since the chase began, he saw a flicker of hope in them. They weren't done yet. They had one last chance. Without a word, she ripped the vent cover off, and they emerged into the docking bay just as their pursuers rounded the corner. "Go!" Lucas shouted, grabbing Selis's hand and pulling her toward the nearest ship. The sound of running footsteps behind them pushed them faster. They had no more time for hesitation. As they reached the ship, Lucas heard the unmistakable sound of weapons being drawn, but it was too late. The ramp of the ship slammed shut just as the first shot rang out, the impact shaking the ship's hull. But they were safe for now. The engines roared to life, and the ship shot away from the Nova Hub, leaving behind the shadows of their pursuers. The danger wasn't over, but for the first time in what felt like forever, Lucas allowed himself a brief moment to breathe. "Thanks," he said, his voice hoarse with exhaustion. Selis didn't respond immediately, but her eyes met his with a silent gratitude. She had fought, she had survived, and now they were both on the run together. But there was no turning back now. The hum of the ship's engines was the only sound that filled the cockpit as Lucas sat in the pilot's seat, his hands gripping the controls with a steady focus. The stars outside were a blur, the ship cutting through the vast emptiness of space as it pushed further away from Nova Hub. For the first time since their escape, Lucas allowed himself to relax. The weight of the pursuit, the danger was momentarily lifted, though he knew it wasn't gone. It never was in this line of work. Selis, sitting beside him, was quiet, too quiet. Her body was tense, every muscle coiled, as if she were still expecting the world to come crashing down at any second. Lucas glanced over at her, noting the flicker of discomfort in her eyes. He couldn't help but wonder what she was thinking. She'd been through so much already, and now with her enemies still on her trail, there was no telling what would come next. But there was something else too, something in the way her gaze met his, something that spoke to an unspoken understanding between them. "You've been through hell," Lucas said after a long moment, his voice softer than he intended. Selis turned her head slightly, her sharp eyes narrowing just a fraction. "You think I don't know that," she replied coolly, her voice steady though tinged with the weight of experience. "But you're wrong if you think this is the end of it." I don't think it's the end, Lucas said quietly, his fingers tapping nervously against the control panel. But we're free for now. That has to count for something. She didn't answer right away. Instead, she just stared out at the endless expanse of stars, her expression unreadable. The silence stretched between them, but this time it didn't feel awkward. It felt necessary. They were both processing what had happened, what they had just narrowly escaped. The danger hadn't passed, not by a long shot, but they had made it through the first hurdle together. It felt strange knowing that they were in this together now. Tell me, Selis said, her voice breaking the silence. Why did you help me? Lucas hesitated. It wasn't the first time someone had asked him that question, but with Selis, it felt different. She wasn't just asking out of curiosity. She wanted to understand why a stranger, a soldier with no personal stake in her survival, would risk his life to protect her. I didn't ask for this, Lucas said, his voice rough. But when I saw you tied up and... He paused, shaking his head, not knowing how to finish that thought. I couldn't just leave you, I guess. I just knew that I couldn't walk away from it. Selis met his gaze, then her eyes searching his face as if weighing his words. You didn't have to help me. I wasn't your responsibility. No, Lucas agreed, I wasn't supposed to, but I did. I guess sometimes you just don't think. You just act. There was a flicker of something in Selis's eyes, something softening in her expression. She didn't speak for a moment, but then she said, You could have left me to die. Many would have. Lucas turned to her a little surprised. Yeah, I guess they would have. And yet you didn't. She studied him carefully, the tension in her face easing just a little. Why? Because I don't know how to leave someone like you behind. Lucas replied, his voice quieter now. I don't care who you are or what you've been through. No one deserves to be treated like that. No one. Selis's gaze lingered on him for a long moment, the silence stretching just a bit longer than it had before. Her eyes were unreadable, but there was something different in the way she held herself now. Something more vulnerable, more human. Thank you, she said, her voice softer than before. I don't know what will happen next, but thank you. Lucas's heart skipped a beat. He wasn't used to receiving thanks. In his line of work, gratitude was a rare thing. People didn't thank officers for saving them, they expected it. But there was something about the way Selis said it, something in the weight of her voice that made him pause, made him realize that maybe he had made the right choice in protecting her. He nodded, not trusting himself to speak. For a long while, neither of them said anything, the silence between them now comfortable, filled with unspoken understanding. They were in this together for better or worse, and whatever came next, they would face it as a team. Eventually, the ship broke through the last layers of atmosphere, and the stars outside became clearer, more vivid. Lucas adjusted their course, guiding the ship toward the safe zone. The Earth Alliance would take them in, give them refuge at least for a while. But as much as Lucas wanted to believe that things would get easier from here on out, he knew better. Their enemies wouldn't just disappear, and there was no telling how deep Varic's involvement in this whole mess went. We'll be safe for now, Lucas said, his eyes scanning the coordinates on the console. I just need to get us to Earth. Once we're there, we can figure out our next move. Selis nodded but didn't reply immediately. She seemed lost in thought, staring at the stars outside the ship's windows. Lucas glanced at her once more, and for the first time he felt like he could understand the weight she carried. She wasn't just a warrior, a prisoner, or a target. She was someone with a past, someone who had survived against all odds. And for reasons Lucas couldn't fully explain, he couldn't help but admire her. Are you going to be all right? He asked after a long moment, his voice hesitant. Selis turned to look at him, her expression neutral once again, but there was a glint of something in her eyes, something that made him think she was no longer just the hardened warrior he had first met. She was changing, and so was he. Together they were starting something new. I'll be fine, she replied, her tone steady, but I'll be better once we're safe, and when we're safe, we'll need to talk about what comes next. Lucas nodded, understanding. For now, their immediate survival was all that mattered. But when the time came, they would have to face the questions that hung between them, the unspoken tension that neither of them had addressed yet. For now, though, they had each other's backs, and that was enough. The steady hum of the ship's engines seemed to fade into the background, as the silence between Lucas and Selis deepened. The journey to Earth would take several hours, but it was hard for Lucas to focus on anything other than the tension that lingered in the cockpit. The small moments of calm between them had been fleeting. He had been hoping that with the immediate danger behind them, Selis would open up, but the coldness she had shown earlier had returned. Selis had retreated into herself again, her back stiff, her eyes distant. She sat with her arms crossed, her posture rigid as if she were trying to make herself as small as possible, as if she could shrink away from whatever thoughts were eating at her. Lucas didn't press her, but it was clear she was wrestling with something deep, something that had to do with her past. After a long stretch of uncomfortable quiet, Lucas broke the stillness. "You never really talked about what happened before," he said, his voice low and cautious. "About why you were being hunted. You told me you were sold, but..." Why? Selis's head snapped up at the question, her jaw tightening, as though she had been waiting for someone to ask. For a long moment she said nothing. Her eyes flickered with a raw intensity that made Lucas hesitate, his curiosity mixing with the knowledge that this conversation could very well be the one that changed everything between them. Finally she spoke, her voice sharp and biting, as though each word were a weapon she was forcing herself to release. "Varic," she spat the name like it was venom on her tongue. "Sold me. My own brother. He sold me." Lucas's brow furrowed in confusion. "Your brother? But I thought he was the one who rescued you from wherever you were being held. He's the one who sent me to take you." Selis's eyes narrowed, her fingers digging into her arms as though she were trying to anchor herself against the flood of emotions threatening to overwhelm her. "He didn't rescue me. He didn't care about me. He never did. He sold me out just like everyone else. For profit." Her voice cracked, a fleeting moment of vulnerability passing through her usually cold exterior. It was a glimpse of the storm she had locked away for so long, and Lucas could see that the weight of it was suffocating her. Her hands trembled and she clenched them into fists, as though willing herself to hold on to the anger that seemed to be the only thing keeping her upright. "Varic isn't just a merchant," she continued, her tone harsh, bitter. "He's a trafficker. He deals in more than just goods. He deals with people. People like me. Like us." Lucas's breath caught. "You're telling me he..." "Yes," Selis shouted, her voice raw with anger. "He sold me to the highest bidder. I was nothing to him but another piece of merchandise, a bargaining chip to make more credits. He didn't care that I was his sister. He didn't care that I'd been locked up in some hellhole used as a weapon for whoever paid the most. He just wanted the money. And when I finally escaped, do you know what he did? He handed me over to you. Just like that." Her fist slammed against the armrest of her seat, the sound sharp and jarring in the confined space of the cockpit. Lucas sat in stunned silence, trying to process what she had just told him. He had always thought of Varic as a powerful man, but he couldn't suspect that Varic had such a dark side. Selling his own sister? He couldn't wrap his mind around it. "Varic sold you," he repeated, his voice barely above a whisper. "But why would he give you to me then? Why go to all that trouble to make sure I rescued you?" Selis's eyes locked onto his, her gaze burning with something that felt like fury and pain all at once. "Because he needed someone to protect me," she hissed. "He knew that I was no longer valuable to him. My worth was gone. So he gave me to you, a soldier, someone who could keep me alive long enough for him to wash his hands of me. I'm nothing to him anymore. To him, I was just a transaction." The truth of it hit Lucas like a physical blow. He had been duped, played like a pawn, in a game he didn't even realize he was a part of. Varic hadn't cared about Selis. He had cared about getting her out of his life, getting her out of the mess he had created. "I don't believe it," Lucas said quietly, though his voice was trembling with disbelief. "You're telling me he never cared about you. He just sold you off?" "No," Selis whispered, the rawness in her voice making the words feel even more devastating. "He didn't care. He never did." Lucas looked at her for a long moment, his heart pounding in his chest. His thoughts were a whirlwind, trying to come to terms with what he had just learned. The anger in Selis's voice was palpable, and it made sense now, why she had been so guarded, so unwilling to trust him at first. She had been betrayed by the one person she should have been able to rely on. The quiet, unspoken rage that radiated from her now made it clear this wasn't just about survival anymore. This was about something far deeper. Selis was angry, yes, but she was also heartbroken. And as much as she hated it, she had been forced to rely on Lucas, someone she had just met, in order to survive. "I'm sorry," Lucas said the words, feeling small and inadequate in the face of her pain. "I didn't know." Selis's eyes softened for a brief moment, just a flicker before the cold mask returned. She didn't speak for a long time, but when she finally did, her voice was quiet, softer than before. "Varic's betrayal is nothing new to me. I've been betrayed by everyone who has ever claimed to care about me. The difference now," she said, her gaze locking with his, "is that I won't let it define me anymore. I won't be some pawn in their game. I'm not a weapon. I'm not a thing to be sold." There was fire in her words, a new kind of strength, one that had been forged in the heat of betrayal. Lucas could see it now, not just the warrior, but the woman who had been broken, rebuilt, and now refused to stay in the shadows of her past. "You're not a weapon," he agreed softly, meeting her gaze. "And you're not alone anymore. I'm with you." Selis's lips parted in something that almost looked like a smile, though it didn't quite reach her eyes. But for the first time, Lucas saw it. A small crack in the armor she had built around herself, just a glimmer of the trust she was beginning to place in him. For the first time since they'd met, Lucas felt like they were starting to understand each other. And maybe this wasn't the end of their story. The stars outside the cockpit windows stretched into an endless canvas of black, each one a distant reminder of the vastness of space and the insurmountable obstacles ahead. Lucas sat back in his chair, his hands gripping the edges of the console, as the weight of Selis's words hung in the air like a thick fog. Varic had betrayed her, his own sister. Not for the first time, Lucas found himself struggling to comprehend the cruelty of it all. But even more than that, he was beginning to feel the sting of betrayal himself. His role in this whole mess had been clear, at least in the beginning. He was the officer. He was the one who had followed the orders, who had rescued the target, who had saved the merchant Varic. He hadn't known about the twisted family dynamics, about the betrayal that lay at the heart of it all. But now, with the truth laid bare, Lucas felt like a fool. He glanced over at Selis, who was staring out at the stars, her face a mixture of pain and cold determination. Her earlier outbursts, the fury, the raw anger she had displayed, had given way to something darker, something more introspective. He could see the emotional toll it had taken on her. She was in many ways still reeling from what had happened, and he understood more than he had at first just how much this betrayal had cut her to the bone. "How do you feel about it?" Lucas asked quietly, his voice hesitant, unsure of what kind of answer he was hoping for. Selis didn't immediately respond, and the silence stretched out between them. The only sound in the ship was the steady hum of the engines as they continued to push farther into the depths of space. Her eyes flickered, but she remained silent, her gaze locked on the unfeeling expanse of stars. For a moment, Lucas thought she wouldn't answer, but then finally she spoke, her voice low but sharp. "Do you know what it's like to be betrayed by the one person who should have protected you?" she asked, her voice tinged with bitterness. "The one person who should have had your back no matter what." Lucas didn't answer immediately. He wanted to say yes, but the truth was he couldn't fully grasp the depth of what she was feeling. Sure, he had been betrayed in his life by comrades, by allies who had turned on him. But he had never experienced anything like what Selis had. He had never had someone like Varic in his life, someone he had loved and trusted, only to have them turn their back when it counted most. Selis turned to him, then her eyes dark with pain. "Varic wasn't just a brother to me. He was my family," she said, her voice breaking slightly. "And that's what makes it worse. He didn't just sell me out. He used me. He treated me like I was nothing. And when it suited him, he handed me over to you. He traded me for his own comfort." The anger that had simmered beneath her calm exterior flared again, and Lucas could see the storm in her eyes. It was like watching someone trying to hold back a tidal wave, all that pent-up rage threatening to break free. He had always known Selis was strong, but this was different. This wasn't just about survival anymore. It was about something far deeper, something that ran to the very heart of who she was. "I didn't ask for this," she continued, her voice raw. "I didn't ask him to make that decision for me. But that's the way of it, isn't it? Everyone makes decisions for me. Everyone decides what my life should be. No one ever asks me what I want. No one ever lets me choose. Her hands clenched into fists, and Lucas could see the muscles in her arms tense as she fought to control the rage that was threatening to spill over. The pain in her voice was palpable, each word a testament to the years of struggle she had endured. The years of being treated like a possession rather than a person. "How can I trust anyone again?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "How can I trust you when Varic, someone who was supposed to be on my side, betrayed me so completely?" Lucas's heart sank. He knew she was right to feel this way. Trust was a fragile thing, and Selis had been shattered by the one person she had trusted most. He couldn't blame her for doubting him. He was just another stranger in her life, another soldier in a sea of faces, who could just as easily betray her as anyone else. "I don't expect you to trust me," Lucas said quietly, his voice tinged with regret. "But I can promise you this, I won't betray you. Not like he did." Selis looked at him, her eyes hard and unreadable. For a moment, Lucas thought she was going to reject his words outright, but then something shifted. Her eyes softened just a fraction, the fury in them, giving way to something else. Something less violent. But just as quickly as it had appeared, that softness was gone, replaced once more by the mask of control she had perfected over the years. "You think it's that easy," she asked, her voice sharp again, "to just forget what happened? To pretend it didn't tear me apart inside? I can't just trust you because you say you won't betray me? It's not that simple." Lucas took a slow breath, absorbing her words. She was right. It wasn't that simple. He couldn't expect her to just forgive and forget, no matter how much he wanted to prove to her that he wasn't like Varic. All he could do now was show her that he meant what he said by his actions, not his promises. "I get it," he said quietly. "It's not easy, and I'm not asking you to trust me just because I say so. But I'll prove it to you. I'll show you that I'm not him. I'm not going to sell you out. I'm not going to use you. I won't make those same mistakes." Selis didn't respond immediately. She just stared at him, her expression unreadable. And Lucas felt the weight of her scrutiny like a physical thing heavy on his chest. But then, after what felt like an eternity, she nodded slightly. "I'll hold you to that," she said, her voice quiet but firm. It wasn't forgiveness, not yet. It wasn't even trust. But it was something. And for Lucas, that was enough. For now. The ship surged through the emptiness of space, its engines humming steadily, carrying Lucas and Selis farther away from Nova Hub. But even as they left the station behind, Lucas couldn't shake the feeling that their troubles were just beginning. The brief, uneasy calm in the cockpit had been shattered by the weight of Selis's words, the truth about her brother's betrayal. He had always thought that with Varic out of the picture, they'd have time to breathe. But now the thought of the merchant and his hidden motivations loomed over them like a dark cloud. Selis remained eerily quiet beside him, her face expressionless as she stared out at the stars. The rage she had expressed earlier was now replaced by something colder, more distant. Lucas couldn't imagine what she was feeling, but he could sense the heaviness in her posture, the way her body seemed to withdraw even further into itself. She was retreating again, locking herself away behind walls of ice. "Are you okay?" Lucas asked, his voice tentative, breaking the silence. Selis turned to look at him, but the look in her eyes was distant, guarded. "I don't want to talk about it," she said simply, her voice flat, giving him little room to press further. Lucas nodded, knowing better than to push. He turned his attention back to the controls, eyes scanning their trajectory. They were on course for Earth, but he knew they weren't out of the woods yet. There were still too many unknowns, too many dangers lurking just beyond their reach. They were running from ghosts, pursuers sent by Varic enemies, from Selis's past, all of them still hunting her, still after the prize she had become. Just as he was about to check their shields, a sudden beeping sound broke the stillness, sending a chill down his spine. His eyes flicked to the monitor, and his stomach tightened as an alert flashed on the screen. "Incoming ship," Lucas muttered under his breath, his fingers flying over the console. The signature on the radar was unmistakable. A ship with military-grade stealth tech. A hunter ship, the kind used by bounty hunters and mercenaries. Selis's head snapped toward him, her eyes narrowing as she saw the readout. "They're here," she said quietly, her voice laced with cold fury. "They found us." Lucas felt his chest tighten, the urgency of the moment creeping up on him. He quickly keyed in the ship's defensive systems, raising shields and diverting power to the engines. But the hunter ship was closing in fast. Their pursuers had anticipated their escape, and they were prepared for it. "They're fast," Lucas said, his voice tight as he worked furiously to outmaneuver them. He could feel the cold sweat trickling down his back. This wasn't just a simple chase. This was a coordinated attack. Whoever was in that ship wasn't just hunting Selis, they were hunting both of them. "Can we outrun them?" Selis asked, her voice low but tinged with something darker, something Lucas couldn't quite place. "We can try," Lucas replied, gritting his teeth as he pushed the ship's engines to their limit. "But I don't know how much time we have." The hunter ship closed the distance rapidly, its sleek black silhouette appearing on the ship's radar. The tension in the cockpit thickened with each passing second. Lucas pushed the ship harder, weaving through debris and asteroid fields, hoping to lose their pursuers in the chaos of the debris belt. But the hunter ship was relentless, staying on their tail undeterred by the obstacles in their path. Then the comms crackled to life, sending a wave of static through the cockpit. "This is Varic," a cold, almost smug voice came through, unmistakable. "I'm afraid you're not going anywhere, Selis. You're coming back to me one way or another." Lucas's breath caught in his chest as his worst fear was confirmed. Varic, he had sent them into this trap. Varic had orchestrated everything from the very beginning. The mission, the ambush, Selis's escape, and now he was closing in for the final strike. "You thought you could escape me, didn't you?" Varic's voice continued over the comms, each word dripping with disdain. "You're nothing but a tool to me, Selis. Always were. Did you really think I wouldn't find you? Did you really think you could just run away from everything I've built?" Selis's eyes locked onto the screen, her fists clenched at her sides, and Lucas could see the fire igniting in her once again. But this time it wasn't just anger, it was rage. Pure, unfiltered rage. "You bastard," she hissed, her voice sharp and full of venom. "You sold me. You used me, and now you think you can just take me back. You're nothing but a coward, Varic." Varic's laugh echoed through the comms, mocking, low and cutting. "You think I care what you think you're mine, Selis? You always have been, and you'll always come back to me. You'll never be free." Lucas felt his grip on the controls tighten, the words from Varic sinking into him like shards of ice. This was worse than he had imagined. Varic wasn't just some distant figure who had given Selis to him as a reward. He was a puppet master pulling strings from the shadows, orchestrating every move with chilling precision. "We need to get out of here," Lucas said through gritted teeth, looking at Selis. The look in her eyes, though fierce and defiant, also held something darker, a storm of unresolved emotions. She wasn't just fighting for survival anymore. She was fighting for her freedom, for her autonomy, for the right to choose her own future. "You can't outrun me," Selis, Varic's voice continued taunting. "Not when I've made sure you have nowhere to run. Your escape was a momentary illusion. You're mine, and you'll always be mine. You'll never be free of me." Selis's jaw clenched so tightly Lucas thought she might crack her teeth. The fury in her eyes was palpable, but underneath it there was something even more dangerous: desperation. She wasn't just angry at Varic anymore. She was angry at herself for being caught in this web, for being manipulated by the one person she had once trusted above all others. "We'll see about that," Selis finally spoke, her voice dripping with defiance. "I'm done being your pawn." Without warning, she stood, her movements swift and calculated, and Lucas didn't have time to react before she grabbed her blaster from the compartment above her head, the weapon snapping into place in her hand. "What are you?" Lucas began, but he didn't have time to finish the sentence. Selis was already on her way to the rear of the ship, determined in every step. "I'm not going back to him," Selis declared, her eyes hard. "Not alive. Not if it means I have to kill every single one of his men to do it." Lucas's heart raced as he realized what she was about to do. She wasn't running anymore. She was going to make a stand, and Varic had no idea what kind of hell he was about to unleash. "Selis, wait!" Lucas shouted, standing up, but she was already gone, her figure disappearing down the ship's hallway, leaving him no choice but to follow her into the storm that was about to unfold. The low hum of the ship's engines was drowned out by the sudden pounding of Lucas's heart. He had barely caught up with Selis as she stormed toward the rear of the ship, her eyes blazing with the same cold fire she had shown when she confronted the truth about Varic's betrayal. Lucas's breath quickened as the adrenaline surged in his veins. The last thing he wanted was for Selis to put herself in even greater danger, especially not now, with Varic's forces closing in fast. "Selis, wait!" He called again, his voice urgent. "You can't just charge in there." Selis spun around her face, a mask of defiance. "You don't get it, do you?" she hissed, her voice low and dangerous. "This isn't just about running anymore. It's about him, Varic. I'm not going to let him win. Not again." Lucas's pulse hammered in his chest as he stepped toward her, trying to reason with the fury that had taken hold of her. "I know you want to make him pay. I get it. But this isn't the way. We need to think, not act out of rage." She shook her head sharply, taking a step back, her eyes never leaving his. "You think I haven't thought about it? I've thought about nothing else for years, Lucas. The lies, the manipulation, the constant running, the constant fear of being sold, betrayed, abandoned by the one person who should have protected me. Varic is the reason I'm like this. He's the reason I'm alone." Lucas swallowed, understanding now the depth of the anger that burned inside her. Varic wasn't just the source of her immediate danger. He was the root of her pain, the one person she had trusted and loved, only to have that trust torn to shreds. There was no denying it anymore. Varic had destroyed more than her freedom. He had shattered her belief in her own worth. "I know you're angry," Lucas said softly, his voice almost pleading, "but this isn't the way. Going back there, throwing yourself at him like this, it'll only hurt you more. He'll win." Selis's eyes flashed with a mixture of grief and pure, unfiltered rage. "He doesn't get to win," she spat, her voice laced with venom. "Not again. If I have to kill every single one of his men to make him understand, then so be it." Before Lucas could stop her, she turned sharply, heading for the rear hatch. His mind raced as he scrambled after her. But there was something in her expression, something fierce and determined, that told him she was beyond reason now. She had made up her mind. Selis, Lucas shouted, his voice carrying the weight of his fear. "Please, this isn't you." She stopped her back to him, her body stiff and poised like a tightly wound spring. "You don't understand," she said, her voice low and tight with emotion. "You don't know what it's like to be a thing, to be sold, to be betrayed by the one person you thought you could trust. He's taken everything from me. Everything." Lucas stepped closer, his heart pounding in his chest. "You're not a thing. You never were. Varic doesn't get to define who you are, Selis." She finally turned to face him, her eyes wild and haunted, filled with a pain that cut deeper than any wound he had ever seen. "You don't know him, Lucas. You don't know what he's capable of. He's done things to me that I can't even describe. And now he's going to make me pay for escaping him, for daring to want my own freedom. You can't stop me from doing this." "I'm not trying to stop you," Lucas said, his voice almost a whisper, his eyes searching hers. "I'm trying to help you, Selis. You don't have to do this alone. You don't have to keep carrying this burden. You've already been through enough." For a long, tense moment they stood there, the distance between them, palpable, the unresolved conflict hanging heavily in the air. Selis's shoulders trembled, her hands curling into fists, but there was something flickering in her eyes, a vulnerability she was fighting to keep hidden. Lucas could see it now, the cracks in her armor, the way the anger was the only thing holding her together. "I won't go back to him," she said, her voice strained, not alive. "And I won't let him take me again. I'd rather die than let him have that power over me." The pain in her words sliced through him like a knife. She wasn't just fighting for survival anymore. She was fighting for her very identity. And Varic's betrayal had cut so deeply that it had left her with only one choice: to fight back no matter the cost. Lucas's mind raced as he thought about what to say. He couldn't let her do this. He couldn't let her walk into the jaws of the beast that had torn her apart. But how could he stop her without pushing her further away? "Please, Selis," Lucas said, his voice cracking with the weight of his own helplessness. "This isn't the answer. I can't just stand by and watch you destroy yourself." She shook her head slowly, a bitter smile curving her lips. "I'm already destroyed, Lucas. You don't know what it's like to be a thing, to be owned, to be nothing but a pawn in someone's game." His heart twisted as he looked at her, seeing not just the warrior, but the woman beneath it, all the woman who had been used and betrayed, who had lost everything she thought she could trust. The pain in her eyes was unbearable, but he knew one thing with certainty. If he didn't stop her, if he didn't find a way to convince her that there was a life beyond vengeance, she would never be free. Varic doesn't get to define you, Lucas repeated, his voice steady, now filled with conviction. Not anymore. You're not just some tool he can use. You're you, Selis. And you can be more than this. More than the anger. More than the pain. For a long moment, Selis stood still, her face a mask of conflicting emotions. Then slowly her hands unclenched, and she lowered her gaze. The fire in her eyes flickered, dimming, and for the first time Lucas saw a hint of uncertainty in her expression. But it wasn't fear, it was something else. Something more fragile. I don't know how to be anything else, she whispered, her voice barely audible. Lucas stepped closer, gently placing a hand on her shoulder. Then let me help you. We'll figure this out together. You don't have to carry this alone. You don't have to be alone anymore. Selis's eyes locked onto his, searching his face, her expression a mixture of skepticism and something else, something raw, something real. And for the first time, Lucas saw her walls crack just a little. Together, she whispered, her voice trembling. Together, he confirmed, nodding, with a certainty he didn't even fully understand. In that moment, Selis allowed herself to believe in something she hadn't thought possible, a future not defined by her past, not dictated by the man who had betrayed her. It wasn't much, but it was a start, and that was enough for Lucas. The quiet hum of the ship's engines was a constant presence in the background, but for Lucas it had become nothing more than white noise. His mind raced the events of the past hours, swirling together like a chaotic storm. He had always been the soldier, the one who followed orders without question, the one who was used to making hard decisions with little room for emotion. But this was different. Everything was different now. He glanced over at Selis, who had settled into a corner of the cockpit, her body tense but her eyes focused ahead. She hadn't said much since their conversation, but he could feel the weight of her presence beside him. They were still in the midst of escaping, still on the run, with Varic's forces close behind. But for the first time, the reality of what was happening had begun to sink in. He had made a promise to protect her, to keep her safe. But as the weight of that promise settled on his shoulders, Lucas found himself questioning everything. The truth was, he hadn't known what he was getting into when he accepted the mission to rescue Selis. He had thought it was just another job, just another routine operation. But now, with everything laid bare, the betrayal, the tangled web of family, the dark history between Selis and her brother, Lucas realized how little he understood. He didn't just have to protect her from Varic anymore. He had to protect her from herself, from the darkness that had been thrust upon her. The pain in her eyes when she spoke about her brother, the rawness in her voice had cut through him in a way he hadn't expected. He couldn't just be a soldier here. He couldn't just follow orders. The man who had once stood resolutely against any threat was now questioning his every decision. The bonds between them had shifted, not in a way that felt comfortable, but in a way that felt human. His thoughts were interrupted by a soft rustling sound. Lucas looked over at Selis, who was now standing, her gaze still locked on the stars outside the viewport. There was something different in the way she held herself, something quieter, more introspective. But the tension in her posture was still there, like a tightly wound spring waiting to snap. "You're thinking too much," she said suddenly, her voice calm but knowing, as though she had read his thoughts. "What is it that's bothering you?" Lucas stiffened, caught off guard by the question. He hadn't realized he was so transparent. It wasn't like him to show weakness, but with Selis, it felt like everything he thought, everything he felt was being laid bare. "It's nothing," he replied quickly, trying to dismiss it with a wave of his hand, but Selis's gaze never wavered. "No, it's not, nothing," she said softly, her eyes sharp, cutting through his defenses. "I can see it. You're torn. You don't know what to do with me." "With this." Lucas's mouth went dry. He had never been the type to wear his emotions on his sleeve, but Selis had a way of seeing through him. She always did. There was no way to hide from her. Not now, not after everything they had been through together. "I promise to protect you," he said quietly. His voice strained. "I don't know how to do that, Selis. I don't know how to protect you from him, from Varic. I don't know how to protect you from yourself. You're angry, and I get that, I do. But it's hard to watch you do this to yourself. Selis's eyes softened for a fraction of a second before they hardened again. I'm not doing anything to myself, she said, her tone low but firm. I'm doing what I need to do. I'm fighting back Lucas. You don't get it, but that's all I've known how to do my whole life. Fight. It's not just survival, it's my only option. I get it, Lucas said quickly, his voice rising in frustration. But that doesn't mean it's the only way forward. You don't have to fight everything. You don't have to keep carrying that anger. You don't have to keep carrying him. For a moment, Selis said nothing. Her eyes were fixed on the viewport as if looking for an answer in the stars. But all Lucas could see was the weight she carried, the burden she wore like armor. Do you think I want to be like this? Selis asked quietly, her voice raw. Do you think I wake up every day and choose to hate him, to hate everything that's happened to me? I didn't choose this. I didn't choose any of it. But I have to live with it. I have to survive Lucas. Lucas opened his mouth to respond, but the words stuck in his throat. She was right. He couldn't begin to understand what it felt like to be in her shoes, to have your own family betray you, to live in the shadow of someone who had used you for their own gain. He could only imagine the pain she carried, the way it had shaped her into the woman she was now. I'm not asking you to understand, Selis said, her voice cutting through the tension. But I'm asking you not to pull away from me. I can't do this alone, Lucas. I can't. The words hit him like a punch to the gut, and Lucas realized then that despite everything, despite the confusion, the fear, the doubt, Selis was reaching out to him. She was letting him in, even if just a little, even if she didn't fully trust him yet, and that meant everything. I'm not going anywhere, Lucas said, his voice steady, despite the storm of emotions raging inside him. I'll fight with you, Selis. I'll fight for you. You don't have to do this alone. She looked at him, then really looked at him, her eyes searching his face as if trying to find something. Her expression softened slightly, though the walls around her heart were still there, guarding the vulnerability beneath. But for the first time since they had met, there was something like trust in her eyes, a crack in the fortress she had built around herself. Thank you, she said quietly, almost hesitantly. I'm not used to relying on anyone. I'm not used to being relied on, Lucas replied with a slight smile. But we're in this together now, whether we like it or not. For a moment they stood there in silence, the weight of their shared journey settling between them. The past, the betrayal, the anger, it was still there, still pressing down on them. But at that moment, Lucas knew one thing for sure: they weren't alone anymore. They had each other, and that was more than either of them had expected. The ship surged forward into the dark expanse of space, and though their future was uncertain, Lucas finally felt like they might have a chance to face it together. The ship's artificial gravity hummed softly beneath them, and the soft clink of metal echoed in the distance as the two of them silently moved back to the cockpit. The tension between Lucas and Selis had shifted since their last conversation. They weren't exactly allies yet, not in the way that some people might expect, but there was an understanding between them now, a fragile bond that was beginning to take root. Selis moved toward the navigation console, her gaze fixed on the stars outside the viewport. Lucas, standing just behind her, hesitated, unsure of whether to speak. His mind kept replaying her words, the raw emotion that had been bared during their conversation. He had never seen her so vulnerable, so human, and yet the distance she still kept was evident, like a shield around her heart. He didn't blame her for it, not anymore. How long until we reach Earth? Selis asked, her voice calm, but there was a hint of unease that she couldn't quite mask. A few more hours, Lucas replied, his voice low. We'll be in orbit soon, but we need to plan ahead. I've been thinking, if Varic is still out there, it's not just going to end once we reach Earth. We need to be prepared for whatever's coming. Selis nodded, her hands gripping the edge of the console. I know, she said quietly, her tone more thoughtful than it had been earlier. I'm not stupid. I know I'm not safe no matter where we go. But I also know that Varic's not the real threat here. He's just a pawn in something much bigger. At her words, Lucas stiffened, his mind snapping to attention. What do you mean? What do you know about this bigger threat? For the first time, Selis turned to face him fully, her eyes narrowing. I didn't tell you everything before, she began, her voice carefully measured. I wasn't sure if you could handle it, but now you need to know the truth. Lucas's brow furrowed. The truth about what Selis took a deep breath, her gaze flickering toward the stars again, as though searching for the right words. Varic didn't just sell me for profit. He didn't just hand me over to you for some petty reason. He did it because he knew I'd never be able to escape unless someone like you protected me. Someone with the ability to fight. The words hung in the air between them like an electric current. Lucas blinked in confusion, unsure of where she was going with this. Someone like me? Why me? Because you're different, she said, her voice low but steady. You're not just some soldier. You've got something. I don't know exactly what it is, but I know you're capable. You can protect me. You have the skills, the instinct. That's why he chose you. You're not just a bodyguard to him, you're a safeguard. Lucas's mind raced as he tried to process what she was saying. Wait, you're telling me Varic knew I could protect you, but I'm just… No! Selis cut him off, her gaze locking with his intense. You're more than just a soldier. You're a weapon. He knew that. And he knew that the only way to keep me alive was to give me to someone who could fight back, who could protect me from the people after me. Lucas's throat went dry. Who's after you? What's going on here? Selis hesitated before continuing, her voice softer now, almost as if she were reluctantly revealing something too dangerous to discuss. Varic is not just some merchant, Lucas. He's tied to a much bigger operation. He's part of a syndicate, a network of human traffickers, smugglers, mercenaries. And I'm not just some innocent bystander in this mess. I'm a commodity. Lucas's heart sank as the pieces of the puzzle began to fall into place. Wait, you're saying Varic sold you because you were worth more as a tool for someone else? As a part of this trafficking ring? Yes, Selis whispered, her voice tight with the weight of her admission. But that's not the worst of it. The syndicate he's working with isn't just some local group. It's an intergalactic operation. They deal with people. And Varic, he's one of their suppliers. Lucas's mind reeled at the enormity of what she was telling him. This wasn't just a personal vendetta between Selis and her brother. This was far worse. This was organized, dangerous. And Varic wasn't just a man with a troubled past, he was part of something monstrous. The worst part, Selis continued, her voice strained, is that Varic doesn't just work for them, he owes them. He's been in debt to the syndicate for years trying to pay off his past mistakes. They gave him a choice: keep me under his control and profit off me, or sell me to someone who could keep me alive long enough for them to take my worth from me. If he didn't hand me over to you, they would have sold him to someone else, someone far worse, and I would have been lost to the galaxy forever. The revelation hit Lucas like a punch to the gut. So Varic didn't want to sell you, he said slowly, trying to piece it all together. He did it to protect himself, and to protect you from being sold to someone even worse. Selis nodded, her eyes dark and haunted. Exactly. But that doesn't make what he did right. He traded me like an object. He used me as a bargaining chip. And now I'm the one paying the price for his mistakes. Varic sold you so I could protect you from the syndicate, Lucas murmured, his mind struggling to keep up. But he didn't tell me about any of this. He didn't tell me what I was really getting into. No, Selis said, her voice hardening again. Because if you knew the truth, you would have never agreed to take me. You would have never become part of this mess. And that's exactly what he wanted. He didn't want you to know that you were being set up as a pawn in a game far bigger than both of us. Lucas stood silently, the full weight of the situation pressing down on him. Varic had manipulated him, played him like a fool, and the price for that manipulation had been Selis's freedom and possibly her life. And now they were both caught in a trap of his making with no easy way out. Varic's not just an enemy, Selis continued, her voice trembling slightly, though her resolve was unwavering. He's a small part of a much larger operation, and if we don't stop them, if we don't find a way to take down the syndicate, they'll come for both of us. They'll come for you too, Lucas, and they won't stop until we're both gone. The gravity of her words settled heavily in the air between them. The war they were now fighting was bigger than they had ever imagined, and the real danger wasn't just Varic, it was the intergalactic syndicate that controlled everything from the shadows, pulling the strings that had tied them together. We need to take them down, Lucas said, his voice steady determination beginning to rise in his chest. We can't let this continue. Not for you, not for anyone. Selis looked at him, her expression unreadable, for a long moment. Finally, she nodded. Then we'll burn it all down together, she said quietly, the fire in her eyes reigniting. Because I'm done being someone's pawn. The ship trembled under the strain of its speed as they entered an asteroid field, the glowing debris swirling around them in a chaotic dance. Lucas gripped the controls tighter, his mind still racing from the bombshell that Selis had just dropped. The truth had come crashing down on them both. Varic wasn't just a villain. He wasn't the ruthless man they had assumed him to be. He was a man trapped, forced to sell his sister, a pawn in a far more dangerous game. Lucas's fingers hovered over the controls, his mind torn. They were still racing toward Earth, but the stakes had escalated far beyond anything he could have anticipated. The syndicate that Varic had tied himself to was far more dangerous than either of them had realized. And Varic himself was a mere cog in their wheel, controlled by forces that even he couldn't escape. But that wasn't the whole story. The part that stuck with Lucas was that Varic had never meant for Selis to be sold off. He had simply been trying to save her from the people who would have killed her, just as Lucas had been trying to do. Selis was still silent beside him, her eyes dark and distant, the weight of the situation pressing on her. She had been betrayed by the one person she had trusted more than anyone, and the person she had blamed for it all wasn't exactly the villain she thought. And yet, despite everything, there was no clear answer. They still had to face Varic, the syndicate, and the deadly force that had orchestrated everything. I don't know what to believe anymore, Selis finally muttered, breaking the silence, her voice filled with a weary frustration that mirrored Lucas's own feelings. I can't tell what's real and what's just another part of their manipulation. Lucas glanced over at her. She was sitting with her head slightly lowered, fingers fidgeting with the edge of her sleeve. The anger that had burned in her earlier was still there, but now it was mixed with confusion and hurt. You're not alone in that, Lucas admitted, his voice quiet. I've been used too, by Varic, by the people who've been pulling his strings. I don't know who to trust either. Selis's eyes met his, the vulnerability in them sharper than before. So what do we do now? Lucas let out a deep breath, his gaze fixed ahead. He knew what needed to be done, but even now he couldn't help but feel conflicted. We have to take them down, the syndicate, Varic's masters. They won't stop unless we do, and we can't just let Varic walk away from all of this. Not after what he did to you, but we can't just fight him. We have to expose the syndicate. It's the only way to end this. Selis nodded slowly, her fist clenching. I'm done running from this. If I have to face Varic to take down the people who put him in this position, then I will. I'll make him understand that I won't be his pawn anymore. Lucas's heart tightened at the strength in her words. She had come so far from being a pawn herself to becoming the woman who would fight back and take control of her fate. He admired her for that more than he could ever explain. Before Lucas could say anything else, the ship's sensors beeped urgently, pulling his attention back to the immediate situation. We're not alone, he muttered under his breath, fingers flying over the controls as he checked the radar. A new signature was approaching fast, and it was unmistakably hostile. A larger vessel was closing in, much more heavily armed than their own ship. The intergalactic syndicate's enforcers. They've found us, Selis said, her voice cold as she stood up, the warrior in her returning full force. I knew this wasn't going to be easy. We can't outrun them, Lucas said grimly, slamming his fist onto the dashboard. We need to fight. Without a word, Selis grabbed her blaster from its holster, checking the settings. The familiar weight of the weapon was comforting, but it was clear that this wouldn't be an easy fight. Not against these forces, not against the syndicate's enforcers. The ship's shaking intensified as the first barrage of energy blasts rocketed past them, narrowly missing the hull. The enemy ship was closing in, weapons, charging for another shot. Get ready, Lucas said, his voice a low growl. We don't have time for hesitation. The battle had begun, and Lucas knew that there was no going back. Not anymore. The ship's hull groaned as the second round of blasts collided with the shields, the entire craft rattling under the intensity of the attack. Selis moved with the fluid grace of a trained fighter, setting up a defensive perimeter, while Lucas pushed the ship into evasive maneuvers, dodging incoming fire. You think they'll stop after this? Selis shouted over the roar of the ship's engine, gripping the edge of the cockpit. Her eyes were cold, her face set in grim determination. These people don't stop unless we make them. Lucas's mind raced, but he knew the answer to her question. They were in the fight of their lives, and the only way out was through. He gritted his teeth and adjusted the controls, pushing the ship into a wild barrel roll to avoid another round of blasts. No, he muttered, his eyes focused ahead. We have to end this now, once and for all. He slammed the trigger for the ship's own weapons, and the ship jolted forward, returning fire in a sudden violent exchange. Their ship shuddered with every impact, but they were holding their own. For now. But the enemy ship wasn't backing off. It was relentless, closing in on them with terrifying precision. They're getting closer, Selis hissed. We need to deal with them, or we're going to be sitting ducks. On it, Lucas growled, his hands flying over the controls, trying to outmaneuver the enemy. If we can get close enough, we can hit their weak points. I just need to get us within range. Another wave of fire pounded the shields, and Selis moved into position, leaning into her seat, her body coiled for action. We can't wait much longer. Selis snapped, her eyes narrowing as she locked onto the enemy ship. They'll board us if we don't take them down now. Lucas nodded, his hands steady as he turned the ship sharply to align with the enemy vessel. He had no other choice. This was the only option left, the only way to stop them. In a final burst of speed, the ship shot toward the enemy vessel, the weapons blazing. There was no turning back now. The deafening noise of battle reverberated through the ship as they collided head-on with the enemy ship's shields. Energy bolts flew back and forth in a deadly dance as Selis and Lucas fought side by side. The clash of metal and force was a chaotic symphony, each blast a reminder that they weren't just fighting for survival. They were fighting for their freedom, for their future. And as the enemy ship began to falter, Lucas and Selis knew this was only the beginning. The real battle, the fight against the syndicate, would come next, but they would face it together, and they would never back down. The battle raged on the sound of blaster fire, and the crackling hum of energy shields filled the air. Lucas and Selis fought together, moving with a synchronicity that had been forged in the heat of their struggle. But the true surprise came when they realized that they were no longer alone. In the heat of the chaos, Selis's sharp eyes scanned the battlefield. She had grown used to this fighting for survival, fighting against the enemies that sought to break her. But something was different now. Something was changing. A series of ships emerged from the darkness of the asteroid field, their sleek forms weaving between the asteroids, coming to their aid. Lucas barely had time to register their presence before one of them, a smaller but heavily armed vessel, linked with their ship's comms. A voice came through the static, strong and determined. "This is Rhea from the Alliance of the Voids. We've come to help. We've been watching. You're not alone." Selis's breath caught, her mind still reeling from the revelation. The Voids. The rebellion. The woman's voice crackled again, her tone defiant. "You don't have to fight alone, Selis. We're here. We've all been where you are." The words hit like a jolt of electricity. These weren't just random ships appearing out of nowhere. They were former slaves, survivors from every corner of the galaxy, united by the very same fight that Selis and Lucas had found themselves caught in. People who had been broken, betrayed, and sold, but who had found a way to rise up. "We've come together," Selis, Rhea's voice continued, her words filled with the fire of resistance. "We've all been where you were trapped, used, discarded. We've all fought to survive. But now we fight to be free. The time for fear is over." The tide was turning. Selis's heart raced as she realized the magnitude of what was happening. She had been one of countless victims, but now there were others like her, rising up from the shadows. People who had suffered just like her, but had refused to let their suffering define them. "Are you saying—" Selis began, her voice thick with disbelief. "We've been organizing," Selis, Rhea interrupted, her voice full of quiet conviction. "They've sold us, tortured us, made us their weapons, their property, but no more. We've gathered forces from all corners of the galaxy. The syndicate's hold is weakening. We're not just survivors anymore. We're rebels, and we're coming for them." The realization settled like a weight in Lucas's chest, but it was a weight that felt somehow lighter, as if the burden of everything they had been fighting for, everything Selis had fought for, was now shared by countless others. The slaves, the exiles, the outcasts, they had found each other and stood together. The ships in the asteroid field began to maneuver surrounding the enemy vessel that had once seemed unbeatable. It was no longer just Selis and Lucas standing against the syndicate. They now had an army at their back, a coalition of fighters who had learned to rise above the pain to stand against the forces that had torn their lives apart. The enemy ship, once brimming with confidence, now found itself under attack from all sides. Their weapon systems, once overwhelming, were faltering under the sheer force of the rebellion. One by one, the Enforcer's ships began to break formation, and the once imposing Syndicate fleet began to fall apart. "Are you ready to end this?" Lucas asked, his eyes locked onto Selis as he steered the ship toward the heart of the battle. Selis looked at him, her face a mixture of determination and something softer, something that might have been hope. "For the first time in my life, yes, I'm ready." They sped toward the heart of the conflict, their ship weaving through the chaos as fire from the rebellious fleet intensified, cracking against the shields of the Syndicate ships. The energy from the battle was electric. This wasn't just a fight for survival. It was a fight for everything. For freedom, for the people who had been silenced for too long. On board the enemy ship, chaos erupted. Selis's mind raced as she recalled the faces of those who had suffered under the Syndicate's reign, slaves fighters, those who had been exploited in the darkest corners of the galaxy. She could hear their voices now echoing in her mind, spurring her forward. They were all counting on her, on Lucas, on everyone who had risen up. "Move in." The Selis Ria's voice came over the comms once more. "We'll cover your back. Take down their command center. We're with you." The enemy ship, once an unyielding fortress, began to crack under the force of their combined attack. Lucas and Selis moved with precision, their ship skimming the outskirts of the enemy vessel, dodging incoming blasts and returning fire with unrelenting force. They broke through the enemy's defenses, flying low beneath the protective shields, and slammed their ship into the heart of the Syndicate's command center. Explosions rang out, rocking the structure as their forces inside initiated a devastating assault. The interior of the ship turned into a battlefield, rebels fighting tooth and nail, reclaiming every inch of the ship that had once been a symbol of oppression. Now, Selis Lucas shouted, his voice filled with urgency. "We need to finish this." Selis nodded, the weight of the past few hours settling around her. But now it was different. Now there was a purpose. The Syndicate's reign of terror was crumbling, and she was going to make sure it stayed that way. She could see Varic's image in her mind's eye, still a man twisted by his choices, but not the true enemy anymore. The Syndicate was the monster, the force that had kept people like her enslaved. And today they would all rise up. Selis burst into the command center. Her blaster raised the heat of the battle in her veins. The command room was a sea of chaos, but in the center stood one figure, Varic. His eyes met hers as she entered, the man who had once been her protector, now standing as a shadow of his former self. Selis Varic's voice cracked, his words filled with a mixture of guilt and resignation. "You don't have to do this. We can still—" "You sold me, Varic." Selis cut him off, her voice cold but strong. "You don't get to make this right. Not anymore." With that, she turned and gave the signal. The rebels launched their final assault, breaking through the Syndicate's last lines of defense. The walls of the command center shook, and for the first time in a long while, Selis allowed herself to feel a sense of freedom, real freedom. The Syndicate's empire was crumbling, and Selis was free. As the enemy ship began to fall apart, the cries of victory rang through the comms. The battle had been fierce, but the rebellion had won. And in the distance, on every corner of the galaxy, there were others like Selis, people who had been waiting for this moment, people who had stood up, refusing to be silenced. The revolution was just beginning. Together, Lucas said quietly, standing beside her, "We'll rebuild." Selis glanced at him, her heart finally at peace. Together. And with that, they turned toward the future, a future free of chains, free of fear. The dust was still settling in the aftermath of the battle, the air thick with the smoke of 1,000 fires. The debris from the enemy ships floated in the void, their once pristine surfaces now shattered, their systems crippled. The once powerful Syndicate that had ruled in the shadows, profiting off the misery of countless lives, was no longer an unstoppable force. But though their grip on the galaxy had loosened, the fight wasn't over. The rebellion had succeeded, but it wasn't a victory without sacrifice. The rebels, their ranks swelling with fighters from every corner of the galaxy, had come together to dismantle the Syndicate. The ships, once symbols of oppression, were now stripped and left as debris, proof of a battle, one of a new dawn, breaking across the galaxy. Selis stood in the center of the battlefield, her feet grounded on the surface of the enemy's ship. Her body was bruised, her face streaked with sweat and ash, but there was something different in the way she stood now. There was a weight in her chest, yes, a burden of everything she had been through. But there was also something else, a sense of freedom, of release. It was a feeling she had once believed impossible. She was free, not just from the syndicate, not just from the chains they had bound her with, but from the years of anger and hatred that had filled her every waking moment. Beside her stood Lucas, his hand resting on her shoulder in silent support. He had fought beside her through it all, through the betrayal, the pain, and the fury. He had kept his word. They had fought together shoulder to shoulder, and now they stood victorious. But it wasn't just them. The galaxy was shifting. The fight wasn't over, but the first steps towards something new had been taken. Ships that had once belonged to the syndicate were now in the hands of those who would use them for good. The rebellion was no longer just a ragtag group of fighters. They had become something far more formidable, a force of change, of liberation. And the galaxy was watching. The call had gone out to the Galactic Council, the ultimate governing body that oversaw peace and law across the stars. They had arrived with overwhelming force, their ships cutting through space like a tidal wave. The Council's enforcers, agents of justice and authority, had descended upon the remnants of the Syndicate's operations, arresting those who had once ruled with fear. The Syndicate's leaders, including Varic, were now prisoners of the law to stand trial for their crimes. Selis felt a strange mix of emotions as she watched the Council's ships sweep in their powerful engines, roaring through the silence. This wasn't the end, not yet. But it was a beginning. The arrival of the Galactic Council was a moment of reckoning. Their justice was swift and uncompromising. Every member of the syndicate who had remained behind was apprehended, taken into custody. The corrupt web that had stretched across countless worlds was finally being unraveled. But as much as Selis had wanted to see Varic pay for the pain he had caused her, there was a part of her that felt a strange relief too. It was over. The battle between them, the hatred that had clouded everything, was over. She had faced him not as an enemy, but as a brother. A man who had made mistakes, who had been forced into decisions that had torn him apart. But in that final moment, standing face to face with Varic, she had seen him not as a monster, but as a man broken by his choices. And at that moment, for the first time, Selis understood. Varic had never wanted this. He had never wanted to hurt her. He had been trying to protect her, but in his twisted, misguided way, he had only made things worse. And now he was paying the price. Selis watched as Varic was escorted by council agents, his head bowed, his expression a mixture of guilt and resignation. He wasn't the same man she had once known. He wasn't her protector anymore, nor would he ever be. But as the truth had come to light, and as they both stood on the other side of the war they had fought, there was an unspoken understanding between them. "I'm sorry," Varic whispered, his voice hoarse. "I didn't know how to fix this. I couldn't." Selis's gaze softened, but only slightly. "You can't fix it. Not now. But you can at least make it right." She paused for a moment, the weight of everything finally lifting. "I won't hate you anymore, Varic. But I won't forgive you either. Not yet." The council agents placed Varic under arrest, and as they led him away, Selis turned away as well. There was nothing more to say between them. He would face justice, and she would continue her journey toward freedom. But for the first time, there was a sense of finality in her heart. The war between them had ended, and she could finally let go of the hate that had held her captive for so long. As the council's ships began to depart, the rebel fleet gathered around them in a show of unity. The galaxy had been forever changed, and the once silent voices of the oppressed were now rising up. The syndicate's reign was over, but the work of rebuilding had just begun. Selis turned to Lucas, her heart filled with gratitude and something more, a sense of belonging, of hope. She had fought for her freedom, and in doing so had given others the chance to do the same. And now, standing together, they have made the impossible happen. "The fight isn't over," Lucas said quietly, his eyes scanning the horizon. "But it's a new world now, a world where we decide what happens next." Selis nodded, her voice steady, but filled with quiet conviction. "A world where no one is left behind. Where we make sure nothing like this happens again." She looked up at the stars, the galaxies that stretched out before them, each one a world waiting to be rebuilt. The future was uncertain, but for the first time in a long while, Selis felt ready to face it. Together. The rebellion was far from over, But the galaxy had learned something important that day. The fight for freedom could never be silenced. And there was always hope, even in the darkest of times. They were not alone anymore. As the last of the syndicate's ships were apprehended and the chaos of battle settled into a quiet victory, Selis stood at the edge of the command deck, gazing out at the endless expanse of stars. The weight of her past, of the anger and betrayal, had been lifted, but the road ahead was still unclear. She had fought for freedom, for herself, for others, and in that fight she had found something more: hope. Beside her, Lucas stood, his eyes reflecting the same quiet resolve. Together they had faced the impossible, and together they had overcome it. The galaxy was no longer a place of silence and oppression, but one of potential and change. "Where do we go from here?" Selis asked, her voice soft but determined. Lucas turned toward her, offering a small, knowing smile. "Wherever we want." And with that, the ship sped into the stars, carrying with it the weight of their shared past and the promise of a future built on freedom, unity, and the unbreakable bonds forged through battle. The fight for the galaxy's future had just begun. What would it hold? No one could say, but one thing was certain: together they would face whatever came next.